What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to Them Nerds. Jerry is here with me across the screen. I am Tony, and today we are going to bring you our top 5 shows that deserve a second chance. Now, we stayed away from most of the comic book stuff that we normally talk about. No Marvel in these lists, right? And there are some really great nerdy properties that we have loved throughout our lives that we thought deserved some kind of a second chance, whether that be a reboot, a spin-off, or just they need to come back and continue, okay? For me, number 5, I have, from 1985 through 1987, the Dungeons & Dragons animated series. Now, I love D&D. I like playing it. I like being the dungeon master. I like watching Critical Role. And this show was one of the first introductions I had to D&D. It had 3 seasons on CBS. The 4th season script was never produced, and they ended up making a cool audio drama of it that you can find out on the internet if you are intrepid enough to search. It was about 5 kids who were sucked into a live-action sort of Dungeons & Dragons world. They were doing some kind of a carnival ride, and they ended up getting sucked into this world. Ages 8 to 15, the kids that were in the show, and they of course took on the roles that you would have been familiar with in D&D in the 80s. You had a ranger and a wizard and so on. It was a little bit cheesy, and I think a lot of the fantasy stuff that we know today wasn't really like as well known, so they went very surface level with it. I would love to see this come back as a live action show, same premise, but with a similar vibe to like Stranger Things, kind of teen based, and it would have some kind of a similar vibe to Jumanji, where the characters are like they go into the world and they look totally different, and they just they have to experience life as one of the players. There was a really cool overtone in this cartoon about the dungeon master being like a person in their little world, even though in D&D, it's the guy running the game. And I would love to see that sort of mechanic come back, especially if it was kind of inside the game, outside the game, back and forth. So that's number 5 for me. Jerry, what do you got? Number 5.
I picked Sliders, which was a TV series from the late 90s. It ran until about 2000. It had 5 seasons with Jerry O'Connell. But it was about a group of scientists that had created a machine to allow them to open wormholes or vortexes and jump into parallel universes. But when they're in the parallel universe, something happens where they have to jump too quickly and they lose the coordinates to get to their own home. So the rest of the series is them trying to get back to their original timeline. And I just think it would be, I think, a cool show to go ahead and do and be able to. It gives you a possibility. It's like a kind of like a Fringe kind of feel to it. So it's like it gives you that what if kind of scenario where even the way that Doctor Strange has it, where there's multiple timelines that are playing out, but they're all just a little bit. They're close enough that you think you might be in your own, and then you realize that you're dogs talk or something. I don't know.
Right. You mentioned Jerry O'Connell. Now he's aged maybe a year or 2 since this show was on originally. Would you have this be a full reboot? Would he be involved in any way? How would you see that?
I would do it a full reboot, but I mean, there could be something cool where they do where I don't remember how the show ended. I want to say that the show ended before they ever made it back to their own timeline. And so if they were still, the original people were still jumping through also, and you accidentally run into them on an episode or something like that. But I think a total reboot for a show that's 20 years old isn't that, since its completion. It's probably 25 years since it was on TV, like it started.
Yeah, so I think it's been long enough where, it would be difficult to bring back the original stars. Other than, like you said, like a cameo away, that would be pretty cool. Cool. Number 4, speaking of shows that ended before their time, for number 4, I would choose to continue Firefly. I know this is like, the rubber stamp sort of nerd wish for shows to come back. Everybody loves Firefly. Everybody wants Firefly to come back. But I mean, I want it. I want it back. We only had 1 season, and we got the continuation with the Serenity movie, I would want to just bring it back, full stop. No reboot, no changes. Get Nathan Fillion, get the rest of the cast if you can, bring it back. Now, Alan Tudyk's character was killed off in the show. Spoilers, and
In the movie.
In the movie, excuse me, yeah. And Joss Whedon has gone on record saying that he would not have killed him off if it was coming back. So I don't know if they could do some kind of magic to bring his character back, but I would love that. And obviously, because they may not be able to get everybody back, and they might need to change it up a bit. A little bit of new crew would be okay, but I would want to keep it as close to the original as possible. That kind of Western space pirate vibe is just something that hasn't been recreated. It's such a special show, and I would love to see it come back. What do you got number 4?
I think that's one of those kind of shows that also can lend some idea into an animated series.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Because you are talking about a show that you're trying to keep the original cast and kind of do a continuation of where it ended. They've all aged considerably. And not only that, but a majority of them have a pretty hectic schedules of acting. So maybe it would be something that you can continue on as a animated series.
I would be totally cool with that. It was on Fox, I believe, right?
Yes.
When it was on. So would that landed in Hulu?
Could. I mean, I don't know whether or not I know it aired on Fox. I don't know whether or not it was a different company that produced it or not.
I'm sure they could find a home for it somewhere because it would have such a big following if it came back.
100%.
So
my number 4 is Alien Nation, which was a series that started off in the late 80s. It only ran for one season, but then Fox continued to do 5 TV movies after that for it. But it was about this premise that a race of alien slaves crash onto Earth in downtown Los Angeles and become refugees within Los Angeles and slowly integrate into the community. And, there's weird things where they only eat drink soured milk, and, they have these spots on the back of their necks that are they're in erogenous zones or whatever.
Oh my.
Yeah. And so, but it's very much based off of the old buddy cop series of movies, like Lethal Weapon or something like that, or I was gonna say Starsky and Hutch, but I mean, I guess it could. Is that the one with the dog? That's Turner and Hooch. So I didn't get the right name. Yeah, so it's like the buddy cop series. So I think that it would be a cool idea to be able to do a cool cop series, but have a little bit of a twist to it, like similar to that movie that was on Netflix not that long ago with Will Smith with the whole
right.
Yeah.
That would be cool. I just remember that was one of those shows that my parents wouldn't watch. It was just they were like, that's too weird. That's too weird. Okay, cool. My number 3, speaking of quirky shows with non-humans, I would have a reboot of Z Nation. Z Nation is the bastard stepchild, whatever you want to call it, of The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead was so ridiculously popular that Sci-Fi, in full sci-fi fashion, decided they were going to have a zombie show too, and it had some pretty decent stars right off the bat. They all got killed off in the first season. And then they were stuck with this kind of B movie cast for the rest of the 5-season run that it had. It was corny. It was quirky. I would probably want to just start this off with a new cast. There are a couple characters that I like that I wouldn't mind seeing back. Doc, who was the skinny old hippie guy, even though he was not a great actor, or at least he didn't act super well in that show. My favorite part of the show was DJ Qualls as Citizen Z. He started off in an Arctic base, and he was trying to contact people, and then by the end of the series he ended up meeting up with the survivor group. I would rely a little bit less on the kind of B movie cheese comedy, and go with they could keep it quirky and not have it super cheesy. One of the things that always bothered me about that show was Murphy, who was the he was a prisoner who they were experimenting, and he ended up turning into a half zombie. And as the show went on, he turned blue, and it was bad. It was real bad. And then he had a kid that was like a zombie kid. There were a lot of things there that I would just scratch that off and not bring back. But I think a reboot of this show, kind of showing the same sort of like quirky, mismatched survivor group, using a little bit more comedy. I would love to see it come back. I think that having it on a streaming service where people could kind of binge it and they could get gauge interest based on that, instead of doing a weekly show where people just lose interest. I think that would be good. Netflix or Hulu or something like that. But with Walking Dead coming to an end and probably kind of seeing in the distance the end of Fear the Walking Dead at some point in the relatively near future, there might be a little zombie-sized vacuum in the world that we need to fill. So that would be my...
Why not have a Sharknado-type zombie thriller?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that was such an unexpected success, Sharknado,
yeah.
Right? And it kind of kicked off this whole era of the Sci-Fi Channel having these like super goofy premises. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. And for me, Z Nation worked. I love Walking Dead because of the kind of like serious, raw take that it has on this zombie apocalypse idea. But on the other hand, I'm kind of goofy and I find weird humor in weird places. And so for me, the idea that you got a bunch of goofballs bouncing around the country, acting like fools, that also resonates with me on a very deep personal level. All right. Did you like Z Nation?
I'll be honest, I watched one episode of it and I thought it was so bad I'd never watched another episode.
So that's a no.
Yeah.
No for you. All right. Got it. All right. What about your number 3?
My number 3 is a spinoff of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I would call it The Watcher, and it would star Faith as the Watcher for the new Vampire Slayer. But you would utilize it kind of similar because, the whole point of during Buffy the Vampire Slayer was Buffy did everything on the good, yet Faith kind of more rode the line of the bad. And so her training this Vampire Slayer to do the right things on it, but then leaving the evil stuff for her to go ahead and take care of. Kind of similar to like how in Gotham, how Alfred was a little bit more violent than what we've seen in the past. So, she would take care of the killings that she wouldn't put her Slayer through. But I think it's a good opportunity also because Buffy ended and then went on for, I believe it's still going on through comic books, and there was a lot of characters that were there that people connected with that should have got a spinoff really, that they just went ahead and let go. And that was more because of WB's whole switching of their genres that they were doing on TV rather than creative, like running out of creative ideas for what the characters could do. So it's an opportunity like you can bring in Willow still and have her, teaching a whole coven of witches and, having, you can. I don't know I think that probably Spike is not going to be able to play a role in it, seeing as though he's well into his 50s and doesn't look like he's in his 20s anymore.
Right.
But I think that it's a cool idea to be able to have a different take on it, where a former Vampire Slayer is now the Watcher training.
Right. I would like that very much. You mentioned Willow. If I don't have a Buffy spinoff or anything on my list, but if I was going to spin something off from Buffy, it would be Willow. Yeah, I love Allison Hannigan, and her character on that show was so good.
Yeah. And I think it could be like something cool, like if you ended up being like, because the show's been off, I believe, for about 14 years or so. So it'd be right around the age that the new Slayer is supposed to be coming up anyways. And so if it, like you gave some kind of like credence to one of the characters who was like maybe like one of the weaker characters, where it's like Xander's daughter who ends up being, the next Vampire Slayer, where you keep it within the main core of the Scooby gang,
Yeah, that'd be super cool. You mentioned the comics. I know that they had a really big following, the Buffy comics, and they continued the storyline, and it's canon, I guess, if you want to call it that. But unless you're an avid comic reader, stuff that happens in the comics, people never really consider it like to be part of the story.
Yeah.
So I think they could sort of pick up where they left off on the show and not consider the comics as really being part of it, and then just go from there. But they could definitely pick and choose elements from the comics. There was a whole they went to Japan or something in the comics. There's like a samurai sort of thing.
Well,
I read a little bit of it.
I'm sure because, like, I mean, the last season was all about how, or the last episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayers, she figures out how to basically channel her whatever makes her a vampire slayer into everybody. Everybody who's a potential slayer all around the world. And so you have all these different slayers everywhere. So,
right. Yep. Cool. I hope that actually happens. I would love to see that.
Yeah.
Buffy was such a great show, and it's funny doing this top 5. All it made me want to do is just go back and watch all of these things. Again,
yeah.
Buffy especially. All right. Number 2 on my list. Behind me here, I have, let me figure out how to move. I have a scene from my number 2 pick, and that is Jericho. Jericho was a 2006 series on CBS starring Skeet Ulrich. Who does that? It only ran for 2 seasons. The premise is that there were nuclear weapons dropped on like 23 major American cities, and it kind of followed the main character's journey trying to figure out what was really going on. Of course, nothing was as it seemed, and the potential for following a really long, convoluted storyline was there. But apparently people didn't care about watching it when it was on because the ratings sucked.
Yeah.
But then after it went off the air, it got so much praise. This was the show that kind of kicked off this idea of fans being like, no, you bring back my show. Because there were people taking out ads in newspapers. There were people, petitioning. They were like dumping like truckloads of letters begging the network to put it back on. And they ended up doing that finale sort of episode movie thing, 2-hour wrap it up sort of thing, which was great fan service. I appreciated it. This is another show that continued along in the comics, just like we were talking about Buffy, and did well. I would love to see a reboot of this, made more for the modern day, especially when we have such an undercurrent in our country right now of like, fear and trying to protect oneself with all this biological stuff that's going on with COVID. And also this sort of like prevalence that we see of, in the last decade or so of like doomsday preppers and, militias and all this kind of stuff. I think that these modern elements brought to this concept could be really successful. I would love to see that full series. Bring it on. Let's see these 1-hour drama episodes, and let's make it right, because Jericho did not get the treatment it deserved. I will say though, I hope that they get a stronger
cast.
Yeah. The only cast member that I really enjoyed was Lenny James, who is Morgan on The Walking Dead now.
Yeah.
And it's funny, he kind of played the same sort of role where he was like kind of the mysterious, like, oh, how does he know these things? Oh, who is he? What does he do? But the whole they brought him back.
The whole premise of the show is you don't know who is the enemy.
Right.
You don't know if it's the government or if it's another government or if it's a fringe group that's done it, and then within the same community, every episode it ends up with somebody being injured or shot.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's why they decided to wrap it up after 2 seasons. They're like, look, we can't shoot anybody else.
Like, we're running low on blood at the blood bank.
You're going to have to go back to chocolate syrup like Psycho. All right. So I know you enjoyed that show. I enjoyed that show. We both watched it pretty religiously. I would love to see that come back. That's my number 2. I've got one left. What's your number 2?
My number 2 is a live action G.I. Joe TV series. Similar to they have those shows on CBS where it's like the CSI or the Navy SEALs and stuff like that, like where it's a little bit more gritty. I know that they've obviously redone the live action movies on whatever, and some of them are good, not all of them. But it would be a potential to be able to build up these characters over a larger score, or a larger season, so that you can actually be able to grow attachment to it. Especially if you have a situation like where you're doing like Disney Plus TV series, so that you can build up things to do movies. If you picked a good enough cast for a streaming service for a live action G.I. Joe, you have the potential to be able to put out a movie that people are going to go watch.
Sure. And when you look at how many important members of GI Joe there were over the years, you know, you have the potential to kind of, you know, just like with Walking Dead, which we've been talking about a lot lately, so it's in my brain.
Yeah.
You have such a huge cast. You might have in an entire season, you might only have like, you know, out of 12 episodes, maybe 2 or 3 focus on Rick Grimes and Michonne.
Yeah.
You know, and then the rest are really focusing on these other characters, and it really builds up a strong cast of characters that you care about. You know,
Yeah.
you're doing GI Joe, maybe you do one episode is kind of like an origin of Destro. Maybe another episode is how Destro and the Baroness came to know each other. Then maybe you go into the background of somebody like Roadblock or Gung Ho, and you know, you can spread out and get all of these different characters and really build up a cast that people care about.
Yeah, and you can always end the episodes where you teach people basic skills like treading water using your arms or your legs.
Knowing is half the battle. It's funny. My wife, who Jerry obviously knows, she whenever I talk about GI Joe or I mention GI Joe, the only thing she can remember about GI Joe is those PSAs at the end. Stop, drop, and roll.
Yeah, I always think of every single time I think of GI Joe, I always think of the Viper. I'm here to wipe the windows.
The Viper is coming. How did that show stay on?
Because we're dumb when we were little.
Yeah.
What's your number one?
Number one for me might be a bit of a surprise. I want to see a full series sort of reboot of the Power Rangers. Okay. Similar to the movies, I wanted to have kind of a teen vibe that is also palatable for adults. Like that's how I feel about the Runaways. I feel like the Runaways was probably geared toward like that 18 to 25 demo, but it was still for people who enjoy the content like my age, which is considerably older than 18 to 25. That's what I want to see. I remember loving Power Rangers when I was a kid, and the idea that they could, you know, the movies were decent. They were okay. I would love to see more of a sort of, you know, the first season exploring the origin, you know, a lot more. Maybe Zordon is not a weird floating, talking turd in a bottle, you know. I think that they could approach it in a little bit more of a modern, a little more subtle, muted kind of way. Maybe they don't have to do a choreographed Tai Chi routine every time they want to turn into, you know, a Power Ranger. But that would be mine. I would love to see this sort of modern take on it. I think that the merchandising possibilities are huge. I think introducing a new generation to it from the beginning could be very profitable for whoever decides to take that project on. So that's my number one. Jerry, what about you?
All right, my number one is probably going to be controversial, but I believe that it deserves it. I believe that there needs to be a Lost reboot. I think that series was so good the first 2 seasons, all the way until about halfway into the 3rd season. And then the writer's strike happened, and it shut down Hollywood for a year, and they lost all of their writers to that show. And I'm sure half of the things that they had planned to do with that show went with those writers. And so it became convoluted where nothing really made sense from the first two and a half seasons to the very end. And I think that you can potentially not even have to forget about the idea that the other Lost ever happened. You just have a whole new set of people end up on the island, and you can play it out the way it was supposed to be played out in the first place. You know, that's still, even though the ending was horrible, I still find that to be one of my favorite shows. It's a show that I could watch 100 times and I don't get bored with it, as long as I leave, you know, a few months between it. But it's like, but there is right around the time that they got into the hatch, the show went downhill.
Yeah.
It wasn't like it went bad. It just never really made sense after that. There was no, you know, there was nothing connecting it to the beginning.
Yeah, it never seemed like they knew what they were doing from one episode to the next.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny you mentioned the writer's strike. One of the shows that I thought about putting on here was Heroes and doing a reboot of Heroes. Heroes was also one of those shows that suffered because of that writer's strike.
If I remember right, I think Jericho also did.
I think you're right. I
Yeah.
think you're right. Heroes got rebooted, kind of.
It was horrible.
It was not good.
No.
Not good at all. but I would love to see that again. But I left it off the list because they already gave it a reboot, so I didn't want to go there. But I would be on board with a Lost reboot if, and only if, they did acknowledge that there was another party that had been on the island, and if it was a completely different cast of characters. I don't want them to like start it over and be like, oh look, we have this mysterious TV show about a plane crash. Like it needs to be like, this first group was here. What happened to them? Where did they go? And that might be one of the big arcs of the show is they find evidence that there was another group that had been there, and they sort of try to figure out what happened to them. And but you're right. They have to have a cohesive. They have to plan the finale before they ever even start writing.
Yeah.
And they have to work to that point.
Well, and I think that if I remember right, because J.J. Abrams was involved in it in the very beginning for the first 2 seasons, and he left it off with the writers that eventually were lost from the show. The only people who did get off an island, I guess. They did have an ending planned, but because they lost those good writers right around the 3rd season, all that stuff that was supposed to get them to the ending was gone. Like you didn't explain Mr. Echo, what happened with him, made up kind of an idea of what a smoke monster was, but never, there was a whole thing about there almost was like dinosaurs and why there was a polar bear and this. It just seemed like a lot of this stuff, there was a whole thing about Walt reading comic books, and whatever he was reading in the comic books came to life on the island. And then they don't really explain what happened to Walter.
No.
So it's like there was a lot of plot holes that need to be redone, and I just think that you can reboot the show. Maybe when you get on the island, you notice like the hatch is already blown up, or you notice like things left on the beach, like where you obviously know there was at some time there was people that were there, but that's as far as it goes.
Yeah. You mentioned the polar bear. I always got, whenever they did one of those weird things like the polar bear or the comic books or the dinosaur thing, like I always imagined that the guys were sitting in the writer's room just smoking a blunt being like, it would be super cool.
Yeah.
A polar bear. And they're like, oh yeah, dude. And they wrote it down and then it made it on TV somehow.
What if all the sharks had Dharma tattoos?
Yeah. Like, no. Hear me out.
Yeah. So I think that's the way you have to go. Like, the whole biblical way that it took a turn at the end didn't make a whole lot of sense from the very beginning. So I think that's what needs to happen.
I think they went down so many weird little pathways that they painted themselves into a corner. I think they got to a certain point about midway through the series where nothing they could do to end that show was going to be satisfying.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So cool. That's a good number 1. I like that one. All right, ladies and gentlemen, those are our top 5 shows that we would like to see get a second chance. Did we miss any? Do you disagree? Do you agree? Do you have a good recipe for corn chowder? Put it in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on the notifications button so that you know whenever we put out more of this nerdy goodness. Follow us on social media at WeThemNerds on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And join us every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and most days in between for a variety of just the nerdiest drippings of our brains. Thanks for joining us, guys. Be good to each other. Bye.
Later.